again. My name is Pam Shoju. I'm a student. I think this is a student talk. And I'm going to talk about joy. My thoughts about joy are still kind of messy, so you know I need my notes. Unlike Koji and Carol, I can't talk extemporaneously for 3 hours. Anyway, last December, during Rohatsu Sesshin, there were a couple sittings where Daishin did a guided meditation for us, and he did that by reciting from the Anapanasati Sutta. I was just looking forward to saying that. And this is the Buddha's instructions on mindfulness of breath. It's 16 steps to compose the mind and body, and it's divided into 4 sections. And these 4 sections are called the establishments of mindfulness. So there's a pattern. The 4 sections are mindfulness of body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of mind, and mindfulness of the objects of mind, things. Anyway, the first section, mindfulness of body, kind of sets a pattern. So the pattern is breathing in, I'm aware that I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I'm aware I'm breathing out. And so on. So, you know, breathing in a short breath, I'm aware. Breathing in, I'm aware of the whole body. And then number 4, it's kind of instruction. Breathing in, I calm the body. So then we move on to the second one, which is mindfulness of feelings. So I'm sitting there, you know, I'm kind of got the pattern. I'm thinking, okay, it's going to be breathing in. I'm aware of, I don't know, feelings, feeling tone, mood, something like that. But the first instruction is breathing in, I feel joyful. And I'm thinking, really? And like many of you probably during Sesshin, you're thinking, breathing in, I feel joyful, and you think, no, not exactly. But then I thought, oh, this is brilliant. You know, this is a way of bringing your mind immediately to how you really feel. And, you know, that's the awareness. But it's doing another thing at the same time. It's reorienting your feelings toward joy. You know, whatever crazy thing you're, you know, feeling at the moment, it's reorienting it toward joy. At the same time, it's bringing your awareness to how you feel at the moment. And then, on the next instruction, it just doubles down. It says, breathing in, I feel happy. So, you know, it's not letting us go with that one. It just keeps going. And then, you know, you get to mindfulness of mind, and there, in that instruction, is an instruction to make your mind happy. Breathing in, I make my mind happy. Isn't this interesting? So this, you know, second, mindfulness of feelings, interestingly enough, after I feel joyful, I feel happy, then it's awareness of thoughts, of mental formations. And this is really interesting that this is in the section about feelings. And so it brings your awareness to, you know, this stuff going on in your head. And then the final instruction is to calm your thoughts. So it's like, okay, reorient your feelings toward joy and happiness. And by the way, calm these stupid thoughts that are getting in the way of you seeing joy and happiness. So it got me to thinking about joy as part of the practice. And it's not something that I had keyed in on before. And once I did, I saw that joy is everywhere in the practice. there's this story of the Buddha having a conversation with an old friend. They were both old. It's probably their last talk. King Pasenadi of Kosala, who I'm sure you all know well. Anyway, the king, during that conversation, he tells Buddha that when he saw the ascetics from the other practices or another sect, they looked like they were miserable, wretched, and leading the holy life dissatisfied. And he said, in contrast, the Buddhist monastics were smiling and cheerful, sincerely joyful, plainly delighting, their faculties fresh, unexcited, unruffled, dwelling with minds like the wild deer. Isn't that a great image? We should be like this. And we aren't always. I remember my brother David came to visit me many years ago. And he came to Sunday morning sitting and service with me. This is when Nona was here. And later he said to me, nobody seems happy there. He said, everybody seems so serious, so glum. And I thought, wow, that's not good. Fortunately, he came back a few years later, and apparently that time somebody cracked a smile. There was laughing. I think George told a funny story about mice in his apartment building. And then after the service, he and I sat down at the kitchen table with Nonan and just had a really pleasant talk for about an hour. And my brother was just, infused with pleasant feelings about the whole thing. So, see, we do radiate to all beings. Some people think Buddhist practice is, really serious, solemn affair. I think in a talk that Daishin gave us in December, he said, we seem to think that we need to be flat, not showing anything up or down. And I read something by James Baraz, which is one of the founders of Spirit Rock Meditation Center. And he said he went through a period of practice like this, confusing the end of suffering with the end of living. And he came to realize that it had a numbing effect on him, shutting down his vitality, making him feel disconnected from himself and from others as well. So he learned that the lack of aliveness and joy is not, a sign of awakening. Quite the opposite. Joy is one of the 7 factors of awakening. And it's not just the fruit of awakening, it's a prerequisite. It's a requirement. So in the Buddha, in his 4 establishments of mindfulness, he makes the point that these 4 sections of instructions on mindfulness help support the 7 factors of awakening. And he kind of goes through that. And regarding this, mindfulness of feelings, joy and happiness, he says when the practitioner breathes in or out, aware of joy or happiness of the mental formations, making mental formations calm, he abides peacefully in the observation of the feelings in the feelings, persevering, fully awake, clearly understanding his state, having put aside greed and distress for the world. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, putting aside greed and distress for the world. But it's true, joy is one of the 7 factors of awakening that the Buddha put out. And these factors are kind of, like a stepping stones. The first one kind of leads to the second, to the third, etc. So, once you really learn to maintain mindfulness, which is the first one, then you can move on to investigation of phenomena, the emptiness of phenomena. That's the second one. And when you can maintain that, then unhesitating energy is activated. That's the third one. And when energy has taken hold, non-physical joy arises. Joyful mind. So joy is the fourth one. And with the mind joyful, feeling your body and mind light and at peace, the body and mind become tranquil, leading to tranquility, which is the next factor. And then, it kind of goes back again to joy, experiencing pleasure, and with the body tranquil, the mind becomes concentrated. Concentration, leads to concentration leads to the next factor, which is equanimity. Oops. Equanimity, which is fulfillment. This is letting go. We also have heard Daishin talking about instructions to the cook and Dogen's idea of the three minds that the cook has to have in preparing food for the community. And the first one of those is joyful mind. He talked with us about that last December in his Dharma talk. And then I ran across a talk by Jill Shepherd, a British teacher. And she talked about the third noble truth as, including an element, not an elephant, an element of joy. She says, after the first and second noble truths, all about suffering, craving, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, stress, clinging, the third brings the good news that dukkha, or suffering, is a treatable dis-ease, leading to liberation and freedom. So, freedom, liberation is sort of always out there as to, what we're trying to move toward in this. And that's an image of more peace, more ease, more happiness, more freedom. When the Buddha, sets out the path toward liberation, in every step, in the path, he talks about a certain kind of bliss associated with it. So, for example, living life in accordance with the precepts leads us to the bliss of blamelessness. And this is real. I've seen it. I've seen it in more than one person. Somebody who's led a life of unwholesome action, makes a turn somewhere in the middle and moves on to living with, wholesome action. You can see them get lighter. You could see the relief. It's like, oh, I don't have to remember all these lies. I don't have to come up with new lies on the spur of the moment. I don't have to hide, it's so freeing. It's the bliss of blamelessness. This is probably the most available to us in our daily lives, in our daily practice. The Buddha also goes on to the idea of sense restraint. This is not diminishing or limiting the senses. This is basically not letting your perception of things get muddied by your thinking and emotional reactions. So, the senses become clearer since the mind's not grasping onto things. And Buddha called this the bliss that is unsullied, not muddied up by our, thinking, emotional mind. And then there are the meditative joys. So he goes on, there's the rapture and bliss born of samadhi, the pleasant abiding of tranquility, the inexpressible bliss of enlightenment. So as somebody said, every few miles on the Buddhist path, there's a rest stop serving joy for free. Interestingly, Buddha said at some point that there's the two paths to awakening. There's an easier path and there's the hard path. And he said the meditative joys are an easier path to awakening than the harder path of dwelling, contemplating, unattractiveness, repulsiveness, discontent, impermanence, perception of death. If you read the early teachings, this contemplation of really unpleasant things seems to be, quite a thing. The Dhammapada, the good monk, is one who spends his time contemplating the unpleasant instead of spending his time contemplating the pleasant. And that can be misconstrued as to what that means. Apparently the Buddha made an early mistake in teaching. He told his followers to sit down, contemplate the most disgusting aspects of their bodies and, all the repulsiveness there. And then he went off into the forest to, enjoy the meditative joys. And when he came back, apparently some of his followers had gotten so disgusted by themselves that they committed suicide. So that was an oops moment. Probably started thinking more about joy after that. But some of this, all this talk about the path, etc., makes joy sound like a far-off goal, like something out there that might happen someday if we're lucky. But joy is not something that happens occasionally or fleetingly as some kind of act of grace. It's something that we can actively cultivate. And we can cultivate it because we already have it. In his talk in December, Daishin talked about the seeds of grace are already there, of joy are already there in us. Gil Fronsdal said, we have a natural capacity for happiness that is obscured by our clinging and hanging on. And if you let go of clinging and grasping, the mind's simple capacity to feel delight and joy increases. Sometimes it's difficult to feel happy. We have challenges, we have difficulties in life, and it's not to, belittle those or diminish them. But at the same time, we don't want to limit our capacity to recognize our own well-being. As Fronsdal says, both of those can exist at the same time. We could deal with challenges, we could keep ourselves open to the capacity for joy and well-being. Sometimes when we get fixated to our difficulties, we start to identify with it. We start to think the whole world is like this. This is me. And we get preoccupied in a way that causes us to lose the bigger picture of what's happening. And what's happening in our lives includes joy and happiness. Daishin, in his December talk, he said joyful mind comes about in part through just contemplating joyful mind. We have these seeds of joy, and by thinking about them, the joy can arise. So that got me to thinking about imagination, just maybe imagining being joyful. And I remembered a story that Jikon told us in a Dharma talk. Jikon said that, when he was younger, he struggled with deep, deep depression. And, something that he had great difficulty getting out of. And at some point, he just started imagining what it would be like not to be so depressed. And he said that was the beginning of his recovery from it. And 2 weeks after that, I heard a story on the Moth Radio Hour on public radio, storytelling. This woman was telling a really similar story about being immobilized by anxiety. She was, confined to her apartment. She was running out of food. She just couldn't bring herself to go out. And she called her mother. Her mother said, come on over. Mother lives 3 blocks away. And she says, how am I going to get to her house? She called a taxi. And during this short taxi ride, she's imagining, the cab driver is a serial killer, is going to take her out to the forest and, torture her. Or they're going to have a terrible accident. She's going to be disfigured. And then they drive up to her mother's house, and she looks out the window at this door, and she wonders, I wonder what it would be like not to feel like this. She said the same thing, that it was, it opened up a door that she could go through to recover from this debilitating problem. But imagination has to be rooted in the present moment. It's not like, some of those pleasant guidances that say, imagine yourself on a tropical beach, the sun shining and the ocean breeze. No, it's Buddha saying, breathing in, I feel joyful. Like right now, finding joy is about the present moment. And, that's the challenge. Jisho actually wrote an article for Lion's Roar about joyful mind, and she said, a joyful heart mind welcomes the moment as it is, free of the static that comes when we're constantly comparing this moment to perfection. So how do we cultivate joy in the way things are right now? Looking at joy as something that's somewhere else might cause us to overlook all the moments and of ease and happiness that might be happening right now. If we start to notice them, then we can get important glimpses of how our heart and mind feel when all that static gets out of the way and we can feel joy and happiness. And these pleasant moments are like supports on the path. So we need to tune in. During meditation, during a retreat, if you have, look for moments of ease and pleasantness, if you can find them, and recognize how that feels. Throughout the day, every day, keep tuning in, acknowledge, any experiences that bring even the slightest trace of gladness, appreciation, gratitude, delight. And don't mistrust it because it's fleeting and impermanent. And don't feel guilty for it because of all the other suffering in the world. I just had a conversation a couple days ago with two of my neighbors, sisters, whose mother was in the house next door to me, getting ready to die. And after that conversation, I just felt so pleased with it. Not because it was about suffering, but because we connected, in a deep way. And so in any of these moments of life, we can find that kind of joy. You start simple. You don't have to feel some blissful, state of joy, just some moment of contentment, gratitude, lightness, and create a habit of experiencing it. Once we get the flavor of gladness, we can just rest in it and savor it. And, we have to let it go, but see if you can maintain some quality of that and let it infuse the world around you. Gratitude also can be helpful, as a practice. In Buddhism, this is knowing and seeing what has been done for one. So recognition and appreciation of the kindness and support that's received from others and that's received from life itself. Well, so what about suffering? Cultivating joy might seem naive, ridiculous. We look around, our survival as a species is in jeopardy, there's environmental crises, there's misery of war, poverty, oppression. And that's on top of what's going on in our own lives. So how is it possible to cultivate joy? In our practice, we cultivate it precisely because there's suffering. We have to make a conscious effort to turn toward non-suffering, gladness and joy, so that we restore ourselves to have the energy to turn back to suffering and difficulty. Joy has a powerful role in balancing out our tendency to fall into grief. When things, Pema Chodron, when things fall apart, she says awakening is really critical in difficult times. We don't need to add more depression, more discouragement, more anger to what's already out there. She says the earth is beseeching us to connect with joy and discover our innermost essence. This is the best way we can benefit others. So of course, there's a pitfall. We need to avoid just chasing good feelings, not becoming attached to these positive states. Some people talk that way about, working their way through deep meditative states. They get attached. Don't try to reproduce a moment of happiness that arises naturally. I've done this myself. During sesshin, I remember once sitting here in the long afternoon sitting, and I'm just sitting, and then all of a sudden a memory came up. I can't tell you what the memory was. I probably couldn't tell you 5 minutes afterward. But it gave me such a feeling of warmth and happiness. It was just, whoa. And then another one came along, another memory right behind. It was like a little train of memories that just kept infusing me with this feeling of warmth and happiness. And then I broke the spell because I thought, well, that was really great. Let me try to think of another one. So I realized after a while, okay, we're grasping. So there's 2 wings of awakening. There's wisdom and there's compassion. Wisdom is this thing called joy, piti, where we gradually learn through practice to see clearly. We see through the clinging, resisting, all the things that are hindrances to they get in the way of allowing joy to shine. On the compassion side, there's something called mudita, or sympathetic joy, described in the early teachings just as gladness. So traditionally, this is experiencing joy for the good fortune of someone else, which then can bring joy to us as well. This is like turning metta, or loving kindness instruction, toward the good fortunes, toward the good things, that happen in life, what's going well. So you're not giving metta and loving kindness to people for what they're suffering, but for what they're, for the joy that they're experiencing. And like all metta, it should also include feeling joy for yourself. So we should appreciate our own good qualities. We should take joy in our good fortune. And in this, we're not just grooving on good feelings for their own pleasant sake. This is intended as a support for freedom. It's channeling delight toward this goal of liberation. So there's a metta phrase that ties gratitude, joy, and compassion together. It is, may all beings receive the blessings of my life. Appreciate the blessings of your life, radiating them out to all beings. So let's go find some joy and radiate it outward toward all beings.